Hi, my name is Zsolt Tihame Visontai, and I'm the concertmaster of the Philharmonia Orchestra. I sit at the front of the orchestra and my job is to help the conductor keep the ensemble together and to help communicate the character of the music. The violin is the highest instrument in the string family. In orchestras, the violins are split into two sections. The first violins, who usually have the melody, and the second violins, who often support the first violins with harmony. The sound of the violin is created by making its four strings vibrate. The four strings, tuned G, D, A, and E, are stretched across the bridge and tuned with the help of pegs at the top and sometimes fine-tuners on the tailpiece. The sound then resonates throughout the wooden body with the help of a small piece of wood inside, called the sound post. Most of the time we use a bow to create sound by drawing it across the strings, like this. The bow is made from wood and horsehair. The horsehair gets coated in rosin, which is a hard resin from trees. The rosin creates more friction between the bow and the strings, which means they vibrate more, making a louder sound.
Hello, my name's Nick Booterman. I'm a viola player in the Philharmonia Orchestra. This is my viola. As you can see, it looks very much like a violin, and in many respects it is identical in its mechanics. It's just perhaps 1 inch, 1.5 inches longer, which creates a lower sound as the string length generally is longer. We share 3 strings with a violin. The violin has a top E string, which we don't have. We have the A, and the D, and the G, and the bottom string that we have that the violins don't is the C, which is 1 octave below middle C. The viola sits in the middle of the orchestra in terms of range between the violins, which are the high, and the cellos and the basses, which are the low. In addition to more interesting parts for the viola section, composers started to write far more solos for one viola player. So as you can see, the viola, like all string instruments, is very versatile, but we sit right in the middle of the orchestra with the heart of the string section.
Hello, my name is Karen Stevenson and I'm number 2 cello with the Philharmonia Orchestra. I'd like to introduce you to my cello. The body of the cello is made of wood, normally maple or spruce. At the top here we have the scroll and then 4 pegs which hold in place the 4 metal strings, which are A, the highest, D, G and C, the thickest string at the bottom, and they reduce in thickness to the top string. So, to make the sound, we draw the horsehair part of the bow along the string like this. We can do an attack to make it sound more exciting. We can do short notes. long notes, and everything you can imagine in between. So we have the 4 open strings of the cello, but that wouldn't be very interesting if we only played those. Not very interesting. So here it is with some vibrato.
My name is Michael Fuller, and I'm a member of the Philharmonia Orchestra double bass section. The double bass is the largest and the lowest of all the string instruments. It is made of wood and has 4 strings. The bass is also unique in that it has its origins not only from the violin family, but also from the viola da gamba family, which was used primarily during the Renaissance and Baroque era. This hybrid history expresses itself in many ways, and also makes the double bass fascinating in that it is the least uniform and standardized of all the string family. Basses have had different shapes, sizes, bows, tunings, and numbers of strings throughout the instrument's history. This bass has 4 strings, and they are E, A, D, and G. And pizzicato, plucking the strings like this. Here's a passage from Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique, where the phrase first appears as arco, and then shortly after as pizz.
Hi, I'm Sam Coles. I'm the principal flute in the Philharmonia. The flute is a member of the woodwind family, and it differs from the other woodwind instruments in that it doesn't have a reed, and you make the sound by blowing across this little hole here and lengthening or shortening the tube with your fingers. This is basically a 19th century invention, the flute. Throughout the 18th century and up till about 1850, the flute was a conical instrument made of wood. But as composers started writing bigger and bigger symphonies and concert halls got bigger and bigger, there was a need for more volume and more dexterity in the instrument. And Theobald Boehm came up with this idea in the middle of the 19th century of making a cylindrical flute out of metal, which gave you much more dexterity. You could whiz around much quicker, and it was a much more powerful instrument. So that's what he did, and that's what he came up with, and that's what we're still playing today.
Hi, I'm Keith Bragg, and I'm the piccolo player in the Philharmonia Orchestra. This is my instrument, the piccolo. It's the smallest instrument in the flute section, and it's roughly half the length of an ordinary concert flute. In the middle register, it becomes rather sprightly, perky, quite pretty. And then in the high register, it can become very strident and actually can cut through the sound of an entire orchestra playing at full volume and add a kind of edge to the sound.
My name's Amy Harmon and I'm principal bassoon of the Philharmonia Orchestra. The bassoon is a woodwind instrument and you play it by using double reeds, which are so called because it's two pieces of bamboo tied together, and when you blow it vibrates. You then attach it onto this metal pipe, which is called a crook, and the air goes in all the way down and up again. It's got a series of holes which are open and closed by pressing keys which change the pitch. It's got a very large range and you can play very low. And then also very high. And then everything in between. Berlioz writes really fantastic bassoon parts, and one of his favourite things to do is have a lot of bassoons playing in unison, which hadn't really been done before that time. There's a particularly good bit in the March to the Scaffold in the Symphonie Fantastique where there's 4 of us all playing the same tune, which starts a bit like this.
Hello, my name's Katie and I'm one of the 2 principal horns of the Philharmonia Orchestra. So I'm going to talk to you about the French horn. It's in the brass group of orchestral instruments. It sits on the right-hand side, slightly away, because we're slightly special. We're slightly special for a couple of reasons. I mean, fundamentally it's the same because you make that bit of weird buzzing sound with your lips. We vibrate our lips to create the sound. That vibration then hits the mouthpiece and then travels through the horn like that. So it goes from an ugly sound to... Now, the horn is quite special in that, firstly, it's played with the left hand instead of the right hand. That is because a while back, before the valves were invented a couple of 100 years ago, we used to change the note with our hand. So like this. That doesn't really give you an even tone, so they added some valves so we can get all the notes without having that fuzzy sound.
My name is Alistair Mackey. I'm one of the principal trumpets in the Philharmonia Orchestra. I've always loved the trumpet, and to play it in a symphony orchestra is a tremendously exciting thing to do. So other instruments I've developed in order to help you. This here is a piccolo trumpet, and it's pitched exactly an octave higher than this trumpet here. And although you can't really play any higher on a piccolo trumpet than you can on a large B-flat trumpet, it does give you a little bit more accuracy in that upper register. I'll play a little bit of Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 2. You could play that phrase, I guess, on a large B-flat trumpet, but I don't think it would sound very good.
This is the modern tenor trombone. It's been a member of the brass family of instruments in the symphony orchestra since the early 19th century, but its history stretches back over 600 years. The design of the trombone is very simple. It's a hairpin shaped tube with a mouthpiece at one end and a bell flare at the other. After about the first 2 feet of pipework, the tube bends to 180 degrees. The player moves the slide with the right arm and adjusts the embouchure to change the pitch. The trombone was known as the sackbut in the early days, and it is now known as the trombone. There was no point in time where anything changed in its design and it became known as the trombone. It was just a change of terminology. If you look at an old sackbut, it would be as if the bell ended there. Otherwise it's just a simple bent pipe. The bore size has grown a very small amount, mouthpieces have got a little bit bigger, and nowadays the valve's been added with this tubing. So it sounds like a few changes, but really very little. It was pretty much spot on to start with.
The tuba. The tuba is the largest of the brass family of instruments. It's also considerably the youngest of that family. It's the baby of the brass section. It wasn't around for 200 years or more after the rest of the brass section was fully developed.
Hi, my name's Andy Smith. I'm going to give you a short tour of the timpani of the orchestra. A little bit of Beethoven 5. It's the opening of the last movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And really has a chance to show off. And that makes the difference to the whole opening of the piece. In the same way, although it works in an opposite sort of way because of the tension on the bowl, the instrument actually gets tighter as you push the umbrella up and looser as you let the umbrella down. So that's how it comes. So you can go So you can actually play tunes and notes by tuning the instruments.
This is the vibraphone. Compared to most of the rest of our percussion instruments, there's quite a bit of technology. The first is the pedal. And the pedal acts rather like a piano pedal. It sustains the sound of the instrument. If I don't use the pedal, it's rather a dry sound like this. But with the pedal, we can sustain the notes. I can use 2 mallets or 4 mallets. Occasionally composers ask for more, but 2 or 4 is the normal amount. If I use 2, this is just a melodic instrument. And with 4, of course, I can play chords. This is a xylophone, probably the most recognizable of our tuned percussion instruments. The notes are made of wood, and the instrument is nearly always played with hard mallets. You'll hear that in a moment. The lowest note is down here, and the highest one is up here. This is a 4-octave instrument, probably the most common of the ranges. And the notes are arranged like a keyboard with the accidentals here and the naturals down here. It's most often used as a melodic instrument. And occasionally composers ask us to do a glissando. But one of its chief characteristics is its ability to cut through the most dense of orchestral textures. So very interesting and a very characterful sound. This is a marimba, probably the largest of our tuned percussion instruments. This particular one is 4 1/3 octaves. The highest note is here, and the lowest note is here. But there are many instruments that go even further than that, 5 octaves. Rather like the xylophone, the notes are made of wood, but unlike the xylophone, the mallets that we use are nearly always soft mallets. And the way we sustain a sound on the marimba is by rapidly doing a tremolo with the 2 sticks. And sometimes we use 4 to provide chord effects. And often the instrument is used melodically. A beautiful sounding instrument, particularly at the lower end of the instrument. At the top end of the instrument, perhaps not so resonant. The glockenspiel, or orchestral bells as it's sometimes known, is traditionally a series of metal notes from small, up here, to large. And manufacturers more recently have introduced resonators and a pedal to help sustain the notes, but always played with hard sticks compared with the vibraphone, which is soft mallets. It can be used very delicately, or more forcefully. So again, a very versatile, sometimes charming, sometimes forceful instrument, but no matter how it's played, will always cut through an orchestral texture. This is a bass drum, traditionally a military instrument and most commonly used in military circles with a pair of cymbals. But it's not only for military purposes it's been used in the 20th century. Sometimes it can sound rather more mellow and quiet. The tam-tam had its genesis in the Far East, and it's a very simple instrument in many ways. It's a large piece of beaten metal, quite thick. This one's about 34 inches across, and we play it nearly always with a large, soft mallet like this one. And I think what's interesting about the tam-tam sound is the way it develops. It actually grows after you've struck it. And we can capitalize on that by sustaining the sound with repeated strokes quite gently and create really some quite extraordinary crescendo effects. These are snare drums, sometimes called side drums, and they're called side drums because they were traditionally played at the side of the body in military circles. Along with the bass drum and the cymbals, they were used as marching instruments. But today, perhaps, we're more familiar with them as orchestral instruments or as part of a drum kit. We have 3 different sizes here. This is a tenor drum. That's a quite different instrument. I'll speak about that shortly. 3 different sizes producing 3 different pitches, but all really producing the same effect. We can play with snares off in that way or with snares on. And the snare on is a different kind of a sound. It adds a different kind of crispness to the sound. Here's the snare off, and here's the snare on. And we can sustain the sound of the snare drum using the sticks, alternating them, bouncing them one to the other. Here's a roll, that's what we call it. Here's a roll with the snares off. And with the snare on, the tenor drum doesn't have a snare. It's always played without a snare. It's quite deep compared to the snare drum, somewhere between the snare drum, side drum, and the bass drum. But perhaps the snare drum is most familiar in a marching type of context. Cymbals have probably the longest history in all our percussion instruments. They're mentioned even in the Bible, in Psalm 150, for example. And they're very familiar to us now as part of an orchestral section. They're very simple. They produce just a single sound, no pitch, no harmony. They can be played like that, rather loudly and with a long note, or they can be played quite quietly and quite short as well. To do that, I'm going to damp them against my body. Sometimes cymbals appear as a single instrument, the suspended cymbal, often used with a single soft stick. Sometimes with a pair of sticks to produce dramatic crescendos and diminuendos. And sometimes with a wood stick, which can be quite short and sharp, or quite long, or we can play in different parts of the instrument, on the dome, right at the edge, or somewhere in between the two. So a remarkably simple instrument, but without parallel in its effectiveness. The triangle is exactly what it says it is. It's a triangle of metal. It's open at one corner to allow the instrument to vibrate. And we can play it with quite a thick stick, rather like this, or quite a thin stick like this, or even occasionally with a wooden stick. To sustain the sound, we can do a tremolo in the top corner or maybe the side corner of the instrument, like this. And I stop the sound simply by holding the instrument like this. Very often in an orchestral situation, the triangle player may have to wait many, many minutes before he or she plays, with a long gap before the next note. But nevertheless, those triangle notes are all important and worth waiting for. Crotales, or antique cymbals as they're sometimes known, made their way to the West in the 19th century in a wave of interest in exotics from the Orient and the Middle East. They're quite heavy to play, they're surprisingly so. They're made of quite thick metal and they produce quite definite notes. We always strike one against the other in that way. I have another pair which is rather lower in pitch. Debussy used these two pitches in one of his works. And I've got just two pairs here, but often we see whole chromatic octaves of these instruments. Many modern composers like to use them in that way. Beautiful sound, delicately played. The tambourine is really a hand drum with jingles, and even today in the Middle East, in Egypt for example, they're played like this. There, of course, they're much larger and much more ornate, but they provide the same effect, a rhythmic background to an ensemble. And the present day orchestral tambourine can be very loud indeed, or can be very quiet indeed. We can sustain the sound by shaking it. And another way we can sustain the sound is by licking our fingers. to provide friction as you rub round the edge of the instrument.
If you've enjoyed learning about the instruments in the orchestra, why not try our iPad app, The Orchestra, featuring Esa-Pekka Salonen and the Philharmonia Orchestra. Fully interactive video playback lets you view the orchestra from all angles, and the revolutionary beat map shows you who is playing when. Follow along with synchronized scores. Hear the inside scoop in audio commentaries, and get a 360-degree view of all the instruments. Available for download in the App Store on iTunes.